Hello, my name's Roger Watson and welcome to this session on From Cells to Systems. The general approach to the material in this session will be systemic, and for the rest of the sessions, when we look at each of the systems in turn, I'll be looking at them under the headings of structure, function and control. For example, taking the heart. When we get to the cardiovascular system, we'll look at what the heart is made of, what it does, and how it responds to change. The content of this session will be based around anatomical and directional terms used in the body, cells, tissues, organs and systems and how they relate to one another, osmosis, diffusion and filtration, which are key processes in the body. First of all then, anatomical terms and directions. We'll look at the terms proximal, distal, lateral, medial, inferior, superior and posterior and anterior. Looking at this diagram here, we can see that anything that is at the top of the body or above another part of the body is considered to be superior. For example, the head is superior to the chest and the thorax. Something that's proximal is closer to the midline of the body than something that is distal. Therefore, the shoulder is more proximal than the wrist. The knee is more proximal than the foot, and vice versa for distal. The body is described down the middle by a medial line, and anything that's to the side of that is described as being lateral to that midline. You can see all of these directions demonstrated on the person on the left. The person on the right also demonstrates anterior and posterior directions. Anterior refers to anything that's in front and posterior to anything that's behind. Next, the anatomical planes. These are imaginary lines through the body that are used to describe different views of the body. These are the sagittal, coronal and transverse planes, and they're demonstrated in the next diagram. And here we see the three planes. The sagittal plane cuts the body along the medial line, and the coronal plane runs perpendicular to that, and these both run from the top of the body to the bottom of the body. The transverse plane, on the other hand, cuts across the body. Other terms: deep and superficial, and these refer, for example, to veins in the body. Some of these are buried deeply within the muscles, and that serves a function. In fact, it serves the function of massaging the veins and helping to achieve venous return. We'll come back to that when we look at the cardiovascular system. Now, the levels of organisation of the body. Starting at the chemical level, we have the atomic level, then the molecular level, then the organellar level, and then the cellular level. Then tissues, which are composed of cells, organs, which are composed of tissues, and systems, which are composed of organs, and finally a whole organism, which is composed of the systems. A whole organism, for example, would be a human being. And this diagram shows how they relate schematically from the atomic level up to the level of the organism. Our focus will be on the cellular, the tissue, the organ, and the system level. And these are shown together in this diagram. Cells are composed of organelles and other structures. Structures such as the plasma membrane, which limits the cell and surrounds it, forms a barrier between the cell and the environment around it. The cytoplasm, which is essentially anything contained within the plasma membrane. The cytoplasm contains the nucleus, which, as you probably know, contains the DNA or the genetic material. The mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell where energy is created. Vacuoles, which serve several functions. The endoplasmic reticulum, which plays a part in making proteins from DNA. And this is a highly schematic diagram. No cell actually looks like that, but that just shows you where all of these particular organelles and structures are. At various points throughout these presentations, I'm going to point you to Bozeman Biology YouTube links. I'm not sure if you're able actually to click on these, but if you go to Bozeman Biology, Google it, take a look at a tour of the cell. This shows you what the cell is composed of, the cell cycle, mitosis and meiosis, which is about cell division and cell growth, something we're not going to go into in detail here. Mitosis and meiosis simulation, it shows you the difference between these two processes of cell division, one which produces identical daughter cells and one which produces gametes, eggs and sperm, and the essential characteristics of life, all of which can be found in the single cell. Next we look at tissues. There are various ways of describing tissues, and tissues can be described as epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And here's a diagram of the four types of tissue. Connective tissue, as the name suggests, connects other tissues together. It's ubiquitous in the body. Epithelial tissue tends to form coatings and surfaces, for example the skin and also the GI tract. Muscle tissue is self-explanatory, as is nervous tissue. These tissues can be further subdivided and subclassified. Epithelial tissue can be classified according to the number of layers. Therefore we get simple, stratified, and pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Simple is simply one cell thick, stratified as several layers. Pseudostratified, for example, in the lining of the bronchi, looks as if it's stratified, but it's not quite the same. Epithelial tissue can also be classified according to cell shape: squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, and the following diagram demonstrates this. Squamous means like a pavement. These are flat, so you find squamous epithelia in the skin. Cuboidal Again, the name is self-explanatory. This is often found in secretory glands and columnar epithelium, which is found, for example, in the gastrointestinal tract. Next, organs. Examples of the organs include the brain, the thyroid gland, the heart, the lungs, the kidney, ovary, liver and muscle, and the skin, which is also an organ. Each of these will be looked at in turn when we look at the systems in the following sessions. Systems are collections of organs. Therefore, the nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, the endocrine system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, renal system, reproductive system, gastrointestinal system, skeletal-muscular system, and the immune system, and we will look at most of these in the sessions which follow this introductory session. Next, the transport processes. The first of these is osmosis, then diffusion, and then filtration. Here again, I'd urge you to go to Bozeman Biology on YouTube and look at the diffusion demonstration and also diffusion and osmosis links. First of all, we'll look at osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water through semi-permeable membranes and depends on the concentration of solutes on either side of that membrane. The higher the concentration of solute, the lower the concentration of water, and therefore water moves in that direction. This can be demonstrated here. If we take a beaker and put a semi-permeable membrane in it, separating two solutions, one with a solute in it, the water moves into the area where the solute is, and the extent to which the water pushes against the air pressure pushing down on it is known as the osmotic pressure. This is very important in biology and in physiology. We'll see this demonstrated later, but here's a very common example using the red blood cell. If a red blood cell is put into a hypotonic solution, that's one where there are more solutes in the cell than outside it, water flows in and bursts the cell. If it's put into a hypertonic solution as shown on the right, then the opposite happens, the cell shrinks. Cells in the body have to be maintained in isotonic solutions where the balance of solutes is the same outside the cell and inside it, and a great deal of energy is expended by cells and in fact by our bodies at rest, maintaining this aspect of our equilibrium, which is also a homeostatic mechanism. Homeostasis will be the subject of the next session. Next, diffusion. Here you can see what happens when we drop a concentrated solution into water. It spreads through. This is a process called diffusion. This is shown here with time-lapse photography. But essentially everything will ultimately diffuse, for example in the air or through a fluid. We know what the effect is of spraying a small amount of perfume, a concentrated perfume in a room. We soon begin to smell it and it spreads throughout the whole room. That's exactly the same process. And it's a process of the molecules of the solute acting with the molecules of the solvent, which in this case is water, or in the case of air, the perfume molecules colliding with the air and being moved through the whole area that's available to them. Again, this is a very important process in biology. And here we see molecules diffusing. At one point they were concentrated on one side of that membrane, which isn't a semi-permeable one, by the way, and then they're at equilibrium across it. That process is called diffusion, so it happens across membranes as well. So we can see here that the net flow is in the right-hand direction until it reaches equilibrium, and there's no net flow. Please note that molecules move in both directions. Diffusion takes place both ways and will continue to take place, but there will be no net flow once the two solutions on either side of that membrane achieve equilibrium. In other words, the same concentration of solute on either side. Diffusion can be described as passive, facilitated, or active. Passive diffusion doesn't require any energy. For example, oxygen will freely diffuse across a plasma membrane, as is shown here. Facilitated diffusion requires specific carriers, but it's diffusion nevertheless, and it doesn't require any energy. It can only work down a concentration gradient. Active diffusion, sometimes called active transport, can work against a concentration gradient because it uses energy to achieve this. And here we see an example of active transport or active diffusion, whereby a proton pump which uses energy in the form of ATP, that's a ubiquitous energy molecule in the body, is being used to expel protons from inside the cell outside to the extracellular fluid. Active transport can also be used the other way to help cells to accumulate materials that they need. So in this introductory session we've looked at anatomical and directional terms, cells, tissues, organs and systems, osmosis, diffusion and filtration. Now I have some questions for you. 1. What are the 4 levels of organisation between organelle and organism? 2. Name the 3 planes through which the body can be viewed, and if you were looking down on a top view, for example, a slice of the brain, which plane would this be? Describe the position of the legs relative to the head while standing, the elbow relative to the hand, the scapulae or shoulder blades relative to the sternum or breastbone, and the nose relative to the ears. Which structure surrounds and contains the cell? Which structure contains the chromosomes? Which structure is the powerhouse of the cell, and what substance are all the structures of the cell contained in? Name the 4 main tissue types. Name the 3 classifications of epithelial tissue by layers, of which type is the skin an example? What are the 3 classifications of epithelial tissue by cell shape, of which type is the skin an example? Which systems contain the following: brain and nerves, heart and blood vessels, muscles and bones, stomach and intestines? Describe osmosis. and finally compare and contrast diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport. Here's my email address if you have any questions or comments. I have a blog called 4 Things About, a simple approach to anatomy and physiology, which you can either click on or you will find easily on Google. There you should look at the From Cells to Systems entry, and there you'll find answers to the questions that I've just asked you. Thank you very much for listening.